I'm your guest host here. Thank you to Alex for letting me come on. I want to talk about the new films that have come out, one of which is Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning, because there's a tremendous amount of information, predictive programming that was in this film that needs to be covered. I'm sure a lot of people saw it because it was the blockbuster for a couple weeks. I also want to talk about the new film Barbie after that, which is probably the most feminist film I've ever seen in my life. I mean, we know Hollywood's dominated by these feminist narratives, but this was the next level. I've never seen anything like this. It was occultic to the core, and you've got basically an entire generation of young girls going to watch this to be completely programmed and brainwashed. So we need to break it down. Everybody's been talking about it. Everybody's been trying to actually defend it as somehow conservative. There's nothing conservative at all about this movie. It was next level feminist brainwashing. But before I get to that, I want to kind of give you some of the background to why Hollywood does this and in what way these films have a connection oftentimes to the deep state or to the intelligence apparatus. One of the great examples of that is Ian Fleming. Has covered this for many years, where he talks about the connection between the establishment of American intelligence and Ian Fleming, William Stevenson, and all these British intelligence operatives coming over. And I want to point out that that's actually in the mainline literature. This is not a conspiracy theory. For example, there's a great book by Ben McIntyre called Ian Fleming, James Bond, and he's a mainline historian. And in that book, he goes into the history of the Special Operations Executive and the way that Ian Fleming set up the 30 Assault Unit, which is one of these kind of SOE created black ops groups. So these black ops groups that Ian Fleming created, very similar to the OPC, which the CIA created, would go around and do a lot of these secret team organizations and operations. The same type of thing that Fletcher Prouty writes about in The Secret Team that you heard Alex and the Dark Journalist talking about. Ian Fleming did the same thing, and so it's modeled on his earlier units and groups. Now, I bring that up because all of the events that he wrote about in the Bond novels actually come from, as Ben McIntyre notes, actual real secret operations. And you can see, again, in the mainline literature there at the bottom, discussing how things like Operation GoldenEye, which was spying on the fascists, and Operation Mincemeat, and all these different operations that involved high-level stagecraft and fakery. Now, why is all of that relevant? Well, it goes even beyond that, because there's an occult component to a lot of the Bond stuff, which people don't know about. And that occult component is that the villains that you see, like Blofeld, they're not just fictions in the mind of Ian Fleming. They're actually based on real-world British intelligence assets and villains like Crowley, as Ben McIntyre notes in his book. So today we're not going to talk about James Bond, but I wanted to give that as kind of a backdrop to explain how when we watch a film series like Mission Impossible, we're getting a lot of that same information revealed and downloaded to us in a, again, well, I don't know what else to say other than revelatory way, an amazingly revelatory way, where we have, I'll do a little bit of rehearsing of the series up to where the story is in the new one, in case you don't remember. And then we'll switch over to analyzing the Barbie film, because I think people are wanting and craving movies that remind them of what it was like to go to the movies in the 1980s with action heroes and interesting plots and stories and villains and characters, because they had some kind of morality behind them. They weren't all propaganda. There were propaganda elements, sure, in every movie going back to the beginning of the camera, but it wasn't as preachy and just dominated by social justice as it is today. And I don't know exactly the motivations behind everything that's going on with these films and why they're so revelatory. They're all very relevant. Every one of these has some element that pertains to modern day terror, war on terror, modern day psychological operations with the scamdemic. And then now, as we're going to see, the AI, chat GPT, et cetera, rollout, and how this is going to be used to essentially control at a mass scale through mass algorithmic predictive programming. Now, again, if you don't remember, predictive programming is the idea that there is a way to prepare the public and propagandize them and seed ideas way ahead of time as a conditioning process. One of the earliest versions of this, I mean, you could go back to the ancient world with literature, but one of the earliest versions of this in the modern era is the spy novel itself. In fact, most of the early spy novel writers and this is actually a book written by a CIA guy. It's called The Great Game, Myths and Reality of Espionage from Frederick Hitz. And this is a whole book about the overlap between the spy world and the reality of spy fiction that underlies that world, how many of those writers were themselves operatives, especially in British intelligence. So again, that happened because you couldn't talk about it due to the Official Secrets Act in the UK. So how would you talk about your exploits, your adventures, your sabotage and so forth if you couldn't talk about it openly? Well, you write a fiction story. So the beginning of this in the modern era is British spy fiction. Then we find out that the same model of the American intelligence establishment, it comes out of the British establishment. In fact, Ben McIntyre in the book even mentions that about Ian Fleming, that he helped to set up the CIA, the OSS and CIA with Bill Donovan. And that was all done on purpose because it's serving that higher level Milner, Rothschild elite. That is the elite that is setting up our private intelligence establishment. They don't work for the people or for the government ultimately. They answer to a higher power, especially the Rockefeller family, who had an amazing level of power and influence when it came to the setting up of this deep state. I mean, they were one of the key players for the American deep state. So to get back to the story of Mission Impossible, this whole franchise. This franchise is actually based on, and you can go back to the original old spy show in like the 60s. I mean, it's based on the figure of E. Howard Hunt. E. Howard Hunt was an actual CIA operative, one of these kind of Fletcher Prouty secret team operatives who was doing all kinds of black ops stuff. And in fact, pretty sure if I recall, interviewed E. Howard Hunt on his deathbed. And E. Howard Hunt himself claimed and confessed to have a role in the JFK assassination. So, I remember at the time talking about how really I think it was only Alex and Rolling Stone that even covered the story. No one else in mainstream media would touch it, even though it should have been, one of the biggest stories out there, that one of the people involved claims to have confessed to it being an assassination. And of course, that was all forgotten. I know Alex remembers it, but maybe somebody should dig that up and play it again because it's pretty wild. But the character that Tom Cruise plays, Ethan Hunt, is based on the real figure of E. Howard Hunt, the real operative. In fact, the smoking man in the X-Files, if you remember the villain of the X-Files, he's also based on E. Howard Hunt, as one of the episodes demonstrates. And so the Tom Cruise character plays this higher than the CIA, higher than the average military person. In fact, even the national security director himself, the director of national security, doesn't even know who who Ethan Hunt is and who the Impossible Mission Force is. And it's odd too that it's always had the acronym IMF, because that's the International Monetary Fund, which is one of the globalist institutions to steal through psychic vampirism the wealth of the nations. And that was set up by the same Milner, Fabian, socialist people who, through like John Maynard Keynes, right, set up all these other operations. I'm saying Keynes helped set up the IMF, and it's a Fabian institution, and the same power structure that Keynes was a part of, these Fabian socialist British establishment, at least they also set up the US, OSS, and CIA. So you understand that's how we're controlled. That's the real power structure. It's not the political class. The political class answers to these people. These are the same people that set up the CFR and the Trilateral Commission, which I covered last week. Anyway, so Tom Cruise represents essentially this kind of deep state figure and his heroic role. You can go all the way back to the first Mission Impossible in 1996, directed by Brian Palma. And as I said, there's a lot of elements that kind of point directly to Fletcher Prouty, secret team type stuff. What's interesting is that, contrary to a lot of spy films up until the 1990s, we actually have CIA people and villains that are themselves corrupt. You could think of 3 Days to Condor with Robert Redford. That film is a great spy film, and it actually also does have, I think, Donald Sutherland plays the villain, who is his CIA handler, who's corrupt. But throughout the Mission Impossible franchise, one thing I will give it credit is that it does consistently admit that it's high-level moles and establishment figures in the U.S. that are extremely corrupt and that are usually working with some sort of international terrorist syndicate. And it's no different throughout this franchise. We know that John Voight is the villain in the first one. But one thing that I didn't realize was that there was a lot of things way ahead of its time in the first installment, which was, you remember Ving Rhames, right, the guy, the villain from Pulp Fiction, Ethan. Yo, Ethan, what's with my Gucci outfit getting a scratch on it, Ethan? Right? If you remember when when Ving Rhames is getting a hole in his Gucci, he blames Ethan. He's actually a cyber freak, right? His name is Phineas Freak. The cyber freaks were the early proto hackers, the 1990s. And one of the things that he's after in the first installment is a special artificial intelligence based microchip. So it's interesting that all the way back then we have the mention in this film series of AI. And that's odd because it's going to play such a key role in the most recent installment of Dead Reckoning. It's all about AI and predictive programming swaying the masses through social engineering cybernetics. So the predictive algorithmic stuff will play a key role in the final installment. But I did want to note that there's a connection between the first installment and the last, which is supposed to be the last installment. It's also interesting, too, that Tom Cruise didn't just star as the CIA operative here. He also played Barry Seal in that was it called American Made, about the CIA drug running, and Barry Seal met a untimely end, if you remember. And that whole movie was about a lot of the stuff that we talk about on this channel. So I have to think that despite the sort of the odd Scientology stuff, Tom Cruise does seem to kind of know to a degree what's going on. We also think about Tom Cruise being in movies like Eyes Wide Shut, which are also very revelatory. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm your guest host, Jay Dyer of Jay's Analysis. And I want to remind you that if you like these topics, these breakdowns, I got a couple books that I did on this, Esoteric Hollywood 1 and 2, which you can get over at my website. Signed copies in the shop. My wife also did a book that you can get in my shop as well, Hollywood Mind Control. And we were talking about the Mission Impossible series and kind of working our way up through those texts, or excuse me, through those movies to get to the deeper subtext, what we call programming elements, which sometimes are, could be corporate product placement, could be political propaganda, or it could be seeding future ideas to condition the public to what's to come. There's a lot of different possibilities here, but if you don't think that's a reality, I would remind you that there's academic texts that have been written about this for many years. I mean, you could go read books like The CIA in Hollywood, How the Agency Shapes Film and Television, and you'll get an insight into how that actually works. Again, at an academic level, it's not a conspiracy text at all. Now, in the second Mission Impossible, the weird part about it is that the film has a giant that's planned by a pharmaceutical company. And the pharmaceutical company really only cares about the pandemic for the purpose of offering information. So if you remember, I didn't remember that was the plot. I think a lot of people have forgotten it, but it's got to have this, it's called BioSite, a giant pharmaceutical corporation. They're going to inject everybody with this, saving serum as a result. And it turns out, of course, that all of that was engineered by a guy named John McCloy. And that's interesting because John McCloy, the character in the movie, the bad guy is John McCloy, but in reality, John McCloy was one of the high-level operatives of the Council on Foreign Relations. So you get a lot of revelation again in these movies, and they'll choose the names, just like E. Howard Hunt, Ethan Hunt. John McCloy is chosen, I think, for a real reason. And I will say another thing that is interesting that came up in the last installment was there's actually a discourse about patriotism, and one of the reasons that the villains in the last installment want to shut down E. Howard Hunt or Ethan Hunt is because he actually still stands for patriotism, and you can't have that in the New World Order where they're going. The technocratic New World Order it necessitates, as H.G. Wells says, the end to all nation states. All of that has to go away through a kind of homogenization of all of the public. And there you see the villains are trying to get a hold of the serum and whatnot. The biowarfare operation, again, very similar to what we saw in the last 3 years. Mission Impossible 3 gets a little more in depth with J.J. Abrams taking on topics like the Vatican and what goes on in secret at the Vatican. And it's kind of a very similar plot to the story of Dan Brown's Angels and Demons. I'm sure it might have had an influence because Mission Impossible 3 came out in 2006, and that was kind of still a hot topic back at that time. And if you read the Tricia Jenkins book that I mentioned, CIA in Hollywood, the CIA was consulting on J.J. Abrams' Alias. So we know we're getting, pretty clear intelligence level stuff. Also, what comes up in these first 3 installments, by the way, is 3D printing. So they seem to have the idea of 3D printing all the way back to the first episode. And then it comes up again in Mission Impossible 3, where you have the masks. Everybody knows about the stagecraft and the fakery in Mission Impossible, where they rip the mask off. And, it's actually Tom Cruise under there. No, and then he rips the mask off again. Oh, no, it's actually the bad guy. But actually, that was a third mask. And then it actually was Tom Cruise. So there's like an infinite, it's turtle masks all the way down. That's part of the gag of Mission Impossible. But we had a lot of things that were also political discussions at that time in the third one, like drone warfare was a big part of it. And again, the Vatican playing a key role in it. And we have, Philip Seymour Hoffman, the infamous villain. Give me the rabbit's foot. Give me the rabbit's foot. You have a wife. I'm going to hurt her. You have a girlfriend. I'm going to find her. I'm going to hurt her. I just had to throw in my Philip Seymour Hoffman impression there, because he only has like 3 lines in the whole movie. So it's like his 3 lines are just, give me the rabbit's foot. I'm going to hurt her. Mission Impossible 4, we get Cold War resurgence ideas, which is interesting because we've seen a revival of this proxy war with Russia now, right? I mean, this was 2011. We get a Swedish villain physicist who is a radical depopulation advocate. So Mission Impossible 4 includes the notion that this figure named Cobalt is intent on engineering a war between Russia and the West, blaming the high-level operatives like Ethan Hunt and IMF, and this will lead to Ghost Protocol and a giant, conflict that can depopulate. Because, as we find out, the next couple installments have this group known as the Syndicate, and the Syndicate wants to not just get rid of IMF and Possible Mission Force, but to actually depopulate. They think that the only way to get out of the problems of the world are to bring about a reset. Yes, they actually use the terminology of reset. I don't remember if it's in 5 or 6, but the Syndicate actually turns into a weird pseudo-messianic cult where they have 12 apostles and this one rabid environmentalist, an environmentalist freak who wants to get rid of the humans. And again, throughout a lot of these later installments, it's actually corrupt people within the establishment, the CIA, senators and others who have been corrupted by this international depopulation organization. Guess what? That's all real. I mean, here is, these Tom Cruise movies telling you how the world really runs. I mean, we know this going back to the Ian Fleming stories about the international elite figure that are represented by people like Blofeld. And here we have it. Yeah, you've got the same type of thing with senators, congresspeople, others who have been compromised, who have been blackmailed and so forth to go along with this syndicate, this rogue nation. And so what's interesting is that when Rogue Nation came out, for example, Mission Impossible 5, there was a lot of discussions of that the global order would have to target the rogue nations. But in reality, there's a rogue nation, an elite syndicate above the nation state that runs the syndicate. So again, in a way, you could say it's actually more revelatory in the Mission Impossible series than even what we find in the Bond films. The Bond films, the last few, they had some revelations about, the Five Eyes, Nine Eyes nations and so forth, and the spying and surveillance and all that. But James Bond is still, British intelligence is still the hero saving us. And it's true that in this, it's, still, the intelligence elite that save us. But I will give it credit because throughout the Mission Impossible franchise, it's typically not the Russians that are the bad guys. It's not the Americans that are the bad guys. It's not even one or two rogue people within the CIA. It's actually an international syndicate that has compromised people in the U.S. government, and that's how they're able to run this operation. So pretty sophisticated, pretty revelatory, and to make it all come home, to get to the main point of the last one, and of course they split the last one up into 2. So we don't know exactly how the last one will end because it's a part 1 of 2. But in the last one, we have a spoiler alert, Chat GPT AI was rolled out, but here now it's a self-learning, self-adaptive artificial intelligence program, something like kind of a higher than Google or whatever, that's really collated all of the data of all of the internet's history into a giant sort of supercomputer framework, where it's not just doing that to do it, it's doing it to figure out potential outcomes in any potential situation. So what is Tom Cruise most likely to do when he's standing on top of a train and he's fighting a villain? Well, we've seen him do it in about 3 or 4 other Mission Impossible movies. So we could probably guess that he's going to jump from one cart to the next to grab John Voight's, but I'm joking. But in reality, in the real world, the real purpose of social media and all the metadata information collecting, big data and all that, isn't just to have a way to sell you a product. That's one level of it. There's a higher level, a deeper level, which is about the predictive programming, the predictive algorithmic tracking. Because if they know the likelihood of the choices that we're all going to make, right, not just choices based on our advertising preferences and consumerist goods, but choices as a whole. So in other words, it's not just about selling you something, but having your whole profile of your psychological makeup as an individual person. And then what are the likely options that you would choose in various situations? And if I know the likely options that you'll choose, and if I know your weaknesses and your likes and dislikes, I now know the means by which to, like a handler would compromise a person in an intelligence operation. Oh, this person has a weakness for, I don't know, for women. Oh, then we're going to compromise them in that way, you see, right? So the weakness is then known, and then they're compromised, and then they're handled and controlled. They're compromised. Now, the movie is about that, but not on the level of an individual operative compromising somebody. It's about the supercomputer AI having a profile of every human being. And through all of the research that cybernetics and MIT and Norbert Wiener and all these people have done for many, many decades, figuring out how to tweak the information in the feedback loop that comes to you through all the social media and through the feed to steer you in a certain direction. In fact, do you remember when Facebook some years ago came out with an admission that, oh, we have been secretly doing a psychological experiment on a lot of our users? Yeah, that's called social media. The whole thing is a psychological experiment to learn how to steer you in a certain direction. Then we had a whole crop of social media engineers, people like Jason Lanier, come out and give testimony and talk about how it was all geared towards steering the public in certain directions based on all of this stuff. Guess what? That's what the movie's about. But it's not just about steering you in certain directions. It's telling this narrative in a Gnostic way, which is very bizarre, because throughout a lot of these films, you'll see this Gnostic narrative, especially a lot of Hollywood films. You'll see the narrative that the creator God is the one that's imprisoning you and keeping you here as a slave. This is in a lot of Tom Cruise movies, Oblivion, Edge of Tomorrow. And then so you have this rebel figure who's this sort of Luciferian rebel that rebels against and initiates a new revolutionary order. But that's not exactly what that's not the Christian view, right? You could maybe read it in a Christian way, but actually I think it's an inversion, because the imprisoning AI God, the villain that represents the AI is this figure called Gabriel. And so I think it's intended to be the biblical God and his angels, archangels like Gabriel, that need to be rebelled against. Regardless, though, it's actually a movie that on the geopolitical level is telling us really what's going on and how we're being controlled. And I think we should have all seen this with the Twitter files coming out, that it's not just Twitter, but the rest of the big tech social media organizations aren't just censoring, they're doing the exact same thing the movie has the AI doing, which is steering people based on their profile, their makeup, their weaknesses. Now I want to move next to the Barbie film, because you might think, well, these are two totally different things. What do they have in common? Well, they actually have a lot in common. I mean, obviously they have big differences. They're totally different movies. I think one reason that Mission Impossible is so successful is that, just like Sound of Freedom, is that people are tired of these social justice preachy movies. And we don't like having these messages constantly rammed down our throat. People want strong male action heroes. That's what we're all used to from the 80s and 90s. And so people thirst and crave that kind of experience. I think Tom Cruise is smart enough to know that. That's why he can make a movie that's successful, that has all those same classic features. Now, when it comes to Barbie, they were worried about the media and people in the alt media and average Americans, actually normal, healthy Americans, I should say, pointing out that this is going to be another feminist brainwashing movie. And so they tried to say, no, it's not feminist brainwashing. In fact, this is different. It's just a comedy. It's not. But that was all deceptive, because if you go and watch this movie, it's 100% the most feminist brainwashing movie I've ever seen in my life. And I didn't watch it because I don't care anything about Barbie, but we do movie analysis. So absolutely, we're interested in doing analysis and figuring out what's going on in this movie. So the movie is premised around the idea that there's an ideal world, a fictional platonic realm, an imagination world where everything is perfect and as it should be, right? Because when you're pretending, you kind of have this, oh, in my pretend world, if you're a kid, right, it's a perfect world. And Barbie in the perfect world hears and learns about this idea called death. So when she hears and learns about death, she starts to experience imperfections, right? Her Barbie feet, which are like this, they become flat. She starts to, her milk goes sour. She starts to have bad breath and has to brush her teeth in the morning. And so things start going wrong in her world. So imperfection has entered her Eden, you see. In the real world, she has to find the real girl that is her handler, so to speak, the person that has her as Barbie. And so Ken, played by Ryan Gosling in this, is a completely beta cuck figure. He does whatever she wishes. He's totally subservient to her. And in that ideal world, in the Barbie world, which is, again, the perfect world, get this, it's all run by women. It's run by a Supreme Court of all women, and all the men are servants to the women. When Barbie comes to the real world to try to find the child that is, her pretend handler or whatever, she finds out that the real world, that's the fallen, corrupt world, is run by the patriarchy explicitly. The Mattel Corporation, where you have Will Ferrell as the demiurge, Gnostic creator god controlling architect character, he's a complete buffoon, and his only desire is to get Barbie under control and to put her in a box as a traditional role. And you might say, well, wait a minute, I thought you said that the ideal world was the world where women were running things. Right, but that's the thing, is that Barbie is actually moving into a new state. She's trying to evolve, is the point of this story. She evolves through falling to become her own independent girl boss. That's the point of the movie. In fact, when she comes to the real world, her desire is not just to reconnect with the girl that she is her handler, imaginary, owner or whatever. It's to inspire that girl to become her own girl boss, right? And there are some comedic scenes because the girl is brainwashed by radical social justice stuff, the little teenage girl. But her mom, who's the one that had the Barbie, is a super girl boss as well. And they realize that human evolution, that's why the movie begins with scenes from 2001. Human evolution requires change from old and traditional roles, because everything is in evolutionary process. In other words, Ken and the men are going to have to learn that it's time to change and evolve, just like the original creatures were women and they evolved, you see. So, I mean, it's supposed to be comedic and satirical, but it's actually telling you a message about the roles of men and women evolving and changing. The next phase of evolution, as you see there, is the old idea of the 50s woman, the Barbie woman. That's the stage of evolution beyond, primitive monkey existence. And women being mothers, she's taking the child and bashing it because she's no longer, she doesn't want to be a traditional role of a mother. In fact, throughout the story, Barbie learns when she comes to self-actualization and self-realization, she tells Ken, look, you be you and I'll be me. We don't need to be we. You don't need to have the traditional roles. I don't need children. So when Barbie overcomes her imperfections through the process of her own fall, she then decides that she wants to incarnate in this world. She wants to become a real person in this world because now men in this world need to understand that there's a new girl boss in town. There's a new girl savior in town. So a lot of films you'll notice have this dark goddess archetype that then becomes the savior, the dark goddess savior archetype. Margot Robbie comes into this world and has decided that it's her job now to basically replace the patriarchy and fix this world. So the ideal world, which experienced a revolution of patriarchy, literally, right? Ryan Gosling's guys take over the Barbie world. It becomes Kingdom, they call it. And the Kingdom is all just this really low tier, ridiculous, meathead kind of stuff where guys don't do anything but lay around and watch TV and drink beer. And the women are sophisticated and they're, master planners, and they arrange this divide and conquer scheme to destroy the Kingdom and bring back the rulership of the all women Supreme Court. I'm not joking. So they outsmart Ken. They bring down the Ken revolution, and they bring in the matriarchy. And they say that that's because that's the ideal form of government. And they even tell the guys at the end who beg for a spot on the Supreme Court, they say, no, we might give you a lower regional court, an appellate court. You're not going to be on the Supreme Court because you haven't learned, you haven't submitted to the girl bosses, you see. Well, again, Barbie decides that since she's fixed, she's been the savior to that world in a sense. She now needs to come into the patriarchal world, our real world, dominated by the corporate sphere, and to fix all of that and to start a new revolution in this world. So feminism and equal rights saved everything in the ideal world, the Eden that fell. And now they're going to fix everything in this world. And the last scene is her going to see a gynecologist, because the joke throughout the first part of the movie was that Kens and Barbies don't have parts, right? Well, now that Barbie's in this world, she has working parts. She's kind of like a Pinocchio scenario, a real girl. And what that means is that she doesn't need Ken. They actually make it a point to say when she comes to this world, she's leaving Ken, the old traditional world, right? Where there's a relationship between men and women, even though it was experimenting with patriarchy, it had to go back to the original matriarchy. They're actually saying that all the ancient world, the original evolutionary higher status was matriarchy. We're evolving to a period of patriarchy, which failed. We experimented with that. They call it the experiment. It failed. Let's go back to matriarchy because that's the perfect ideal. Then she comes to this world to bring us the ideal matriarchy, the girl boss world order, right? And what does she do? She goes to the gynecologist because now she has female parts. And I think the point of that was that now those female parts are going to be determined for her. They're not going to be determined in a marital role where she's going to give birth. They're going to be parts that she determines as her own new girl boss, you see. Women's liberation, women's freedom. Women are not there anymore to be mothers. They're there now to be leaders and girl bosses. And you see there from the very beginning of the film, every time the guys are interacting, they want to fight. And the sophisticated women settle everything, and they're very intelligent. They're hyper intelligent, settling the disputes between the low IQ, toxic masculinity, weirdos there. And they are weird. Like the guys are all effeminate, but they also have toxic masculinity. It's very bizarre. But ultimately, there's absolutely no way that this could in any way be conceived of as traditional. I mean, the fact that the daughter, who is a radical social justice warrior, Marxist, the fact that she decides to drop a little bit of her extreme radical Marxist stuff and be reconciled with her mom, that doesn't make it a conservative movie. I mean, the whole movie is about rejecting anything traditional because we evolve, and we can evolve into new, quote, higher states of individuality and feel-goodiness, right? Whatever makes me feel good. And so at the end, when Ryan Gosling's character is coming into masculinity. He reads a bunch of books, starts lifting weights, starts drinking beer and acting kind of goofy, right? Barbie has to then lecture him on how none of that appeals to her. That's not masculinity. And he's gonna have to submit again to the women. Well, guess what? Women don't like men that submit to women. That is not what turns women on. That's called being a beta. And women don't like betas because it's not biological. You can't go against biology, and everybody that does is fighting a losing battle. I want to remind you that this is the show, and head on over to the store to get some of those excellent products to fight the support. Go to my website, jasonelsis.com. Buy the books. You get signed copies in the shop. Follow me on YouTube. I did a big debate this week. I did a bunch of really in-depth interviews. I want to go deeper into the analysis of the films. I did a really deep dive on Mission Impossible, Indiana Jones, and others. This is the show, and I'm your guest host, Jay Dyer of Jay's Analysis.